Hi, good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Fanshen Cox. She is a proud alum of the University of Michigan. Can you give her a go, Blue? Give her something? Okay, there you go. She majored in Spanish and education. She went on to get graduate degrees at Columbia and Cal State University, Los Angeles. You'll learn about her life and career path, but she also was a volunteer in the Peace Corps in West Africa. She is an award-winning playwright, actor, producer, and educator, and toured the country for several years doing a one-woman show called One Drop of Love. She's currently a producer and development executive at Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's Pearl Street Films. And she's a co-author of The Inclusion Writer, which is something that we're going to hear about and talk about a lot tonight. And she's also a co-creator and co-host of a popular podcast called Sister Brunch. You do a lot. Without further ado, let's put our hands together for Fanshen. Yep.
Thank you, Dean LaFontaine. Thank you so much to Lynette Iannace. Do you all know Lynette? Does everybody here know Lynette? Can we give it up for her? You'll notice that I keep looking over at her because she's the boss, in case anybody didn't know. She really, it's been wonderful to work with you the last several months in putting this together. And Carolyn Yoon, thank you so much for recommending. Yes, give it up for her too. Thank you so much for recommending me for this, and to Dave. We'll get to talk a little bit later. So I like to start any conversations I have by talking about my name, not only because it is a bit unusual, a lot of people haven't heard it, but also because I believe that names are super, super important. For one thing, often it is the first thing that anybody actually learns about you. Sometimes before they even meet you, they've already heard your name. And a lot of times they take that information and they already start to think things about you based on your name. They might think about your racial identity. They might think about your gender identity. They are already creating perceptions about you without even meeting you. And another reason why I like to think about names is because we had zero control over our first names. Now, some people might have changed them once you got old enough to change them, but that initial name you were given was given to you by someone else, and that is a really interesting story. So a lot of times when people say, I don't have an interesting story around my name, it's not anything, I guarantee you do. Ask your parents or ask the people who named you how you got your name, and there's a whole story that can unfold there. But I want to tell you a little bit about my parents. So my mother, Mama Trudy, and you must call her that. Do not call her Miss Cox. Do not call her Ms. Trudy. She is, just everybody say Mama Trudy. Say Mama Trudy. Good, we'll get that out of the way. Mama Trudy was born and raised in a tiny town in it's called Joseph, Oregon. And she loved herself some animals. She loved horses. This is actually my great-grandmother. This is my Mama Trudy. This is my great-grandmother's horse, Sundancer. She loved cows and chickens. She lived on a farm. And this is kind of how she grew up. And she had to have these relationships with these animals because her home life was a little tough. So my grandmother, my grandma Lynn, she early on left my mother's father. His name was Grant. She left him and she decided to get married to a guy named Leighton Hamilton because Leighton Hamilton had some money. But Leighton Hamilton also drank a lot. And very early into their marriage, one night, Leighton Hamilton threatened to kill my mother and her sisters and her mother with a rifle. And so, fortunately, Grandma Lynn divorced him right away. But soon after that, she married him again. So actually, Grandma Lynn was married 8 times, and twice of those were to the same guy twice. So Mama, yeah, you can listen, it's funny. It's okay. It's all good now, right? So Mama Trudy grew up with some challenges for sure, but she also always had this love. Part of why she developed relationships with these animals is that she needed that love and she was getting it from them and she was giving it to them. So Mama Trudy eventually grew up to become a nurse. Now you may not be able to find her in this picture, but she is the only one here whose skin color matches the uniform. That is my Mama Trudy. Mama Trudy went to nursing school at Howard University. She was the only white student at Howard University. And Mama Trudy was constantly entering into new worlds. She didn't even know when she was little, but that's what she ended up doing. She had to leave that really tough situation and constantly push herself into new worlds. So at Howard, not only was she in this new world with all black students, and she was the only white one, but they were also exposed to her world. And so they were constantly entering into new worlds. Mama Trudy then became a certified nurse midwife, and she helped a whole bunch of babies enter into new worlds. She had her own private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where I grew up. Anybody from Cambridge here? No? Not even one shout out? What if I say go blue? Everybody's good with go blue. That's always an easy one. I'll just do that. Okay. So Mama Trudy had her private practice. She was helping people enter into new worlds. She also was a winter mountaineer. She loved winter mountaineering. She loved that kind of world. So even though we were raised in the city, she loved to go into new worlds, into nature in the cold. And this is my favorite Mama Trudy story. So Mama Trudy had to go to an assisted living facility as she got older. And she went to an assisted living facility in Boston. Anybody here been to Boston? Yeah, I know you've been to Boston. Okay, all right. I grew up in Cambridge, and Boston is a pretty segregated city still, yeah? And so was her assisted living facility. So she walks in the first day at the assisted living facility, goes to the cafeteria, and it is segregated. So the white residents are all on one side. The black and brown residents who are Haitian and Dominican and Vietnamese, they're all on the other side. And she walks in, and the white residents go, "Come here, over here." Now, Mama Trudy, who has never met a stranger, had no problem going over and hanging out with these white residents. She was fine with that. But the next day, this is how Mama Trudy dressed to go into that cafeteria in her Malcolm X by any means necessary shirt, and she made a beeline for those black and brown residents in the cafeteria. That was my Mama Trudy. My dad, Winston Barrington Cox, was born in Jamaica. So he was born in the 1930s in Jamaica, and at that time, Jamaica was actually still a British colony. And so, unfortunately, his mom, my beloved grandma Cynthia, she actually had to be out of the home because she worked as a live-in nanny and a maid for a British naval officer. And that meant essentially that my father was left to raise himself in Kingston, Jamaica, and it was tough. My grandmother was only 14 years old when she had my dad, and so she had to do this kind of work, but he also had to raise himself. And so he, very similar to my mother, decided that he wanted to get out and to go and enter into new worlds. And so my dad ended up traveling a lot. He ended up going to Tanzania. He wanted to experience the Ujamaa movement in Tanzania, which was a socialist community in Tanzania. He was looking for a place to raise us, my brother and me. He was looking for a place to raise us to be self-respecting and socially conscious citizens. And he wanted to find a place where racial and class oppression was completely absent. And if anybody here finds that place, please let me know. We're still looking. But my parents meet, and these two people who initially had entered constantly into these new worlds, now were entering into a world together. And when they got married, interracial marriage was still illegal in 16 of the United States. And so here they were entering into this world where they were shunned for getting married. My mother's family disowned her for marrying my father. And publicly and privately, they were always having to have conversations about this. But they were deeply in love, and they were reading a book together. And the book was Fanshen. So this is the beginning of Fanshen. That's kind of the first paragraph as you open the book. And it says, every revolution creates new words. The Chinese Revolution created a whole new vocabulary. Now, a most important word in this vocabulary was Fanshen. Now, literally, it means to turn the body or to turn over. But to China's hundreds of millions of landless and land-poor peasants, it meant to stand up and to throw off the landlord yoke and to abolish what they called word blindness and learn to read, to establish equality between the sexes. But it actually meant a whole lot more than this. It meant to enter a new world. And so I was one of those lucky ones who actually appreciated what I got named. Now, this was not easy when I was little or when my neighbors, who I still know, still call me Fashion, but I was lucky that I actually felt that I had something, that I was given this kind of verb of a name that I could take out into the world. And so I then set about to thinking about how could I constantly enter into new worlds. So one of the first ways I did that was to become an actor. I don't think that's what my parents wanted me to do, but that's okay. I think they wanted me to like start a revolution, go to war, but that, not war and peace. But that's not what I did. Instead, I became a performer, because as a performer, you are constantly entering into a new world. For you to be authentic and represent a character, you have to understand their world. So this is my high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we were really lucky that we had these incredible drama teachers, theater teachers, who knew that it was important to enter these new worlds, and the only way you could do that is to bring kids from all over into our theater program. And so they would never cast those of us who were like, I want to be an actor, or those of us who had the resources to actually be actors. Instead, they would go to the chess club. They would go to the math club. They would go to the football team. In fact, Chris Albergo, the guy who's the lead character here in this play that we got to write, he was on the football team. And that's me there on the left. And then this little tiny pipsqueak here on your right is someone you may have heard of. Some people know him as Jason Bourne. That's Matt Damon. But Matt Damon didn't get the leads in our plays. the Chris Albergos got the leads, because our teachers understood that you must enter into new worlds in order to bring truthful perspectives of your characters. I then followed Chris's lead, and I joined the tackle football team of my high school. Now, here's the thing. Our high school was really good at sports. Patrick Ewing went to our high school. We had some famous folks go to our high school, but our football team was terrible because they never let them play on the football team because they were too precious on the track team. And so I knew that all I had to do was try out, and I could be on the tackle football team, and I was. And fun fact that I came to U of M after high school, and your legendary coach, Bo Schembechler, actually watched me play football because they recruited our quarterback that year. Yes, they did. Hey, give it up for me. That was hard. Okay, good. Thank you. Bo Schembechler knows my name. As Dave mentioned, after graduating from the University of Michigan here, I joined the Peace Corps. I entered into a new world in the Cape Verdean Islands in West Africa, and I taught English as a second language there, or we call it English as a foreign language there. And then I continued to teach. I loved teaching ESL, so I did my master's at Teachers College, Columbia University. I taught in the South Bronx in New York for quite a while. And then I moved to Los Angeles, in part to pursue an acting career, but I also continued to love teaching. In LA, my students were from all over. I had students, anyone been to LA at all? Okay, Glendale. What's the majority of the folks in Glendale that are probably learning English? Anybody know that? Is that a little too specific? Armenians, so there are a lot of Armenian students in Glendale. I got to enter into that world, into that culture. I also taught in East LA, at East LA College. The students there were Chinese students, a lot of Chinese students. We had a lot of students from Central America. So with all of this, I was constantly entering into new worlds. And then I entered into the very interesting world of Hollywood. It's just interesting. So one of the things that I did there in Hollywood early on, I wanted to be an actor. I kind of kept teaching, but decided to go to Hollywood to really kind of finally pursue it. And I kept getting this messaging from the agents that I would audition for that they didn't quite know what to do with me. So I sometimes had to ask them, did you send me out for black or did you send me out for white for this audition? And then I would have to decide how I would do my hair, how I would speak in the audition. But finally, I ended up creating my one-woman show, One Drop of Love, and really finding myself as an actor by being a writer and being a producer and telling my own story. And the story of One Drop examines the construction of race in the United States and the ways that that construction affects our personal relationships. So not only was I entering into new worlds, I was starting to see the importance of both individual impact and change and also systemic impact and change. I then, after a couple of years doing One Drop and traveling across the country and entering into new worlds all over the United States, I started working at Pearl Street Films. And I think we'll talk about this some more with Dave. But because I had grown up with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, did anybody see Project Greenlight when Effie Brown? Okay. This recent one where Matt decided that it was okay to teach a black woman about diversity. Okay, so I'm glad some of y'all didn't see it, but go back and watch it. It's it changed some of the trajectory, especially for white men in Hollywood, which is that Matt ends up in a situation where he tells a black woman how to hire diverse people, and that she's doing it wrong and that he's doing it right. It was a mistake. But the good news is the next day I called Matt and Ben and I said, who are you? What has happened to you? Where are my friends from this progressive city we grew up in? And I ended up working at Pearl Street. And through my work at Pearl Street, I co-authored The Inclusion Rider because Matt and Ben agreed that they would kind of be the guinea pigs for taking this inclusion rider into their negotiations for their contracts with studios and actually telling the studios that inclusive hiring was important to them. I'm going to talk to you more about the Inclusion Rider tonight. I hope you'll consider taking it into all of the work that you do. But I want to tell you about my incredible co-author, Kalpana Kodagal. So she's up here. I'm supposed to be able to use this, and I'm not even going to try because I know I'm going to mess up all the slides. But Kalpana Kodagal there up on the upper left corner, she is a civil rights attorney with an expertise in labor law. She is the reason that not one attorney in Hollywood has ever been able to shut down our negotiations for the Inclusion Rider. These are also my colleagues, Rashad Robinson. He's with Color of Change, a very important civil rights organization, and Aisha Thomas Pettit from AMC Networks, because eventually AMC signed on to the rider for their entire company, and Dr. Tasman Plater at Endeavor Content. And again, I'll share more about that in a bit. And I enter into new worlds every single week as the co-host of the Sister Brunch podcast. And kudos to you for saying sister. You got it right, Dave Mayer. As the co-host of the Sister Brunch podcast, we highlight Black women who are surviving and thriving in entertainment and media. And these stories are so important for everybody to hear. Although our guests are Black women, what we find often is that we have listeners who never actually have the opportunity to listen to the stories of Black women and what it is like for them to work work on sets or to be in the C-suite alone often, almost always. And so this is an opportunity for these women to help the entertainment industry enter into a new world, enter into the world of a Black woman in Hollywood. And as I was on all of these paths, as I understood what my parents wanted for me and started to get out into the world and travel internationally, this kind of, I think of it as like a mantra, started just coming up for me all the time. These kind of 3 words that are actions just constantly kept appearing. Every time in all of these situations, from Mama Trudy in the cafeteria to my performing One Drop of Love and hearing people's stories and seeing how we can actually make change, it occurred to me that there are 3 necessary elements, and those are truth, justice, and love. Now, you know that I used to be a teacher, so I'm going to make you repeat after me. I'm going to count to 3, and after I say 3, I would like you to say truth, justice, love. 1, 2, 3. Truth, justice, love. Yeah. If you take anything with you after this today, that is the most important thing, because that is your guide for having an impact. That is your guide in having an impact in your storytelling. That is your guide in having impact in the industry you decide to work in. That is your guide when you are in the position of hiring. Truth, justice, and love. Now, especially in the last few years, when I talk about truth, justice, and love, I get this kind of side-eye look, and people ask me what I mean by truth. And unfortunately, there are a lot of different answers to that. Now especially. But my response is the truth lies in the non-dominant narratives. What are the stories that you haven't heard? What are the voices that we don't get to hear enough of? And that's what I mean when I say truth. So I have some examples, and I'd like you to think of examples. We're going to take a look later at how I use truth in the inclusion writer and use examples there as well. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I look at truth and how especially I get exposed to these non-dominant narratives. Do you all know about intersectionality? Raise your hand if you've heard of it, you know it. Okay. So intersectionality was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And she is a sociologist, she's a professor, she is an activist, and she's also an attorney. And she had a lawsuit in which she was helping a Black woman who was certain that she had been discriminated against by her employer. Now, the employer said, but we are not racist. I mean, look at all of the Black people we have on our staff. Look at all of the Black people we've hired. And Kimberly Crenshaw said, yes, but they're all men. And then the employer said, but wait a minute, we're not sexist. Look at all of the women we have. And Kimberly Crenshaw said, but they're all white. There's something important and particular about the experiences of a Black woman that marginalizes her within all of those categories, and then we tend to forget to fight for her when we talk about anti-racism. We talk about patriarchy. Where do we fight for the Black woman? Where do we think about that experience of the Black woman? So intersectionality is really important, and it's not just about race or gender. It's about ability or disability. One thing we get a lot in Hollywood, especially when we bring the inclusion writer to a company, a production company that's already quite diverse. Let's say it's a Black-owned production company. And they often say to us, we don't need the inclusion writer. Look how good we're doing. Look at everybody we have. But then we watch their show, and the entire cast is light-skinned. And so they're not thinking about colorism. They're not thinking about often people with disabilities. So intersectionality pushes you beyond the dominant narrative to think about what are the voices that are missing. Another truth that we are starting to finally kind of unpeel and think about is the land that we're all on right now. This University of Michigan. There were people here, in fact, Michigan, the name itself, is from people who were here before we got here, before it was colonized. And so it's really important to share this non-dominant narrative about this land, and that it is not only what happened in the past and how we got here, but there are still today indigenous people and places that were preserved. And that is part of our non-dominant narrative that has to be a part of how we do impact work. We have to tell the truth about this. This is from an Ann Arbor website, a2gov.org. You can also go to illuminatives.org, and they have great guides around how to do land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements can be done at the beginning of events, at the end of events. It's about really stopping and thinking and reflecting on who was here before us and those non-dominant narratives. Another non-dominant narrative that is a real uncomfortable one to talk about is the invention of whiteness. So sometimes when I bring this up, people are like, we talk about white all the time. White is the dominant narrative. Absolutely, white is the dominant narrative, but the invention of whiteness is not. We don't talk about where this thing came from. What does it mean? How did white people become white? Because we know from scientists that it is not really a thing. It is not something you can measure and say, it is definitive now, your DNA says that you're white. So it came from somewhere. And so one of the stories I like to share about the invention of whiteness, and this was long after the word white or Caucasian had already been invented, but the story of Takao Ozawa and Bhagat Singh Thind. So these were two men in the 1920s, and both of them really wanted to become United States citizens. Takao Ozawa was a Japanese man born in Japan, and then he moved here for school. He went to Cal Berkeley. And he went to Cal Berkeley and loved the United States. He decided that he felt American. He wanted to be American. He wanted his US citizenship. But in the 1920s, the only way that you could become a naturalized US citizen, meaning that you came here from another country and became a citizen, in the 1920s, the only way you could become a citizen was that you had to prove that you were white. In the 1920s, as recently as then, the only way you could become a naturalized citizen was that you had to prove you were white. There were some concessions for people of African descent, because they had already brought us over here. What were they going to do with us? And some concessions for Native and Indigenous people. But if you came to this country and you decided that you wanted to be part of this country, you loved this country, you could not unless you could prove you were white. Takao Ozawa took his case all the way to the Supreme Court saying, I am white. I really am. He said, I don't let my family speak Japanese at home. We only speak English. He said, I go to church with only English speakers and only white Americans. I am white. In his court case for the Supreme Court, he even said, I never go out in the sun. I'm so white. And the Supreme Court comes back with their decision and they say, we're so sorry, Mr. Ozawa, but we have checked in with the scientists, and the scientists are very clear that in order to be white, you have to have heritage from the Caucasus Mountain region. That's why we say Caucasian. Please stop saying that word. You have to have heritage from the Caucasus Mountain region, and you do not. You are from Japan. You have no heritage from there. They denied him his citizenship. But just 3 months later, 3 months later, Bhagat Singh Thind, he's watching the Ozawa case very carefully because his case is about to come up before the Supreme Court. He was born in India, and he was wealthy, and so he knew that being wealthy in India pretty much made him white, and he was a veteran here in the United States. He knew for sure that he was going to get his citizenship, and most importantly, he was born in India in part of the Caucasus Mountain regions. His case was done. He knew it. He knew he would get his citizenship. 3 months later, he brings his case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, we're sorry. Actually, in this case, science doesn't really matter anymore, and instead we rely on the common man. And the common man knows that you are not white. And they denied him his citizenship too. So really, the non-dominant narrative about whiteness is, it's a lie. And so what does that mean about the work that we have to do to dig in and understand how that makes up the work that we're doing, the impact work we're doing? We have to tell the truth about that. You can snap it out. I saw you, yes. We have to tell the truth about that. So I talked to you about truth, and those are some examples, and I hope that in your work and all you do, you will take this idea of the non-dominant narrative, telling the truth, and take it into your work and push for it. Push to hear the stories that haven't been told. That's certainly what I do in Hollywood. And the reason that we have to start with those non-dominant narratives, we have to start with that truth, is because that informs us around how we pursue justice. A lot of times without that full truth, we start to pursue justice, but we're missing a whole lot of people and a whole lot of stories and a whole lot of perspectives and a whole lot of worlds that we need in order to pursue justice in a meaningful way. So it's truth and it's justice. And then everybody's like, okay, just get to the love part, please, because this is hard. And I agree, it's hard. But here's the good news. Now, I'm a hugger, and this has been hard. COVID's been real hard for me. Lynette knows, as soon as I saw her, I was like, can we hug it out? She was like, nope. I'm a hugger, and hugging is love, but it's not this kind of love. And saying I love you and being a kind person and believing everybody's a human being, that's a kind of love. But really what love is, when you tell the truth and you pursue justice based on the truth, that's love. That's how you show love to everybody that you are going to go out into the world and work for and work with and eventually hire. You want to show them love? Speak truth with them. Pursue justice with them. That's love. So I'm going to make you say it again. And count to 3. After I say 3, we all going to say it together. Truth, justice, love. 1, 2, 3. Truth, justice, love. Yes. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we use truth, justice, and love with the inclusion rider. And the most important thing is, so raise your hand if you even know what this thing is. Anybody even know? Oh gosh, okay. So back in I always get this wrong. I wonder if someone can correct me. I think it was the 2016 Oscars. An actress named Frances McDormand won the Oscar for Best Actress. And when she was giving her acceptance speech, she said, I want to leave you with 2 words tonight, inclusion rider. And me and my colleagues said, holy heck, because we had been working for months on this inclusion rider. And the inclusion rider is a clause that can be added to a contract that says that it is important to the person with leverage who's taking this contract and taking this clause into their contract that says, it is important to us that you hire inclusively on this job. And so because I was working with Matt and Ben, we went to Matt and Ben and we said, would you be our guinea pigs? Would you take this writer into your negotiations with the studios and tell them that it is important to you to add? A lot of fancy celebrities and actors, they like to add some silly stuff into their contracts, like they get a certain luxury trailer while they're on set. But this is a clause that says that the studio is committed to hiring cast and crew inclusively. Cast and crew that actually looks like what the world looks like. So I'm going to take you through the steps of the inclusion writer. The first step of the inclusion writer is that you deepen and diversify the hiring pool. Have you heard of the Rooney Rule? Come on, y'all, this is a football school. Okay, good, at least that, okay? So the Rooney Rule is for the NFL. And they use it when they're going to hire coaches. And they have to, I think that they have to at least interview 2 diverse coaches for every position that they're hiring for. So our first step of the inclusion writer is similar to the Rooney Rule in that we say, as you are starting to think about your hiring for a film or a television project, you deepen the pool of people that you're going to consider. So you're pushing yourself to make sure you're considering a broader number of people. And the next step is then to actually take the time to set some targets and benchmarks. Now, for clarity, this is not quotas. This is not about tokenizing anybody. This is not about, oh, as long as we've got someone who's indigenous, then we're okay. You have to find qualified people, and you have to target hiring qualified people into these positions. So you state with the person you're negotiating with, these are the number of people we want to hire in these positions. And this is also flexible. And you have to be when you're hiring for a film, because you might be filming in Atlanta, and Atlanta, it's challenging to sometimes find the kinds of folks that you want to hire in a diverse way. Or you might be filming overseas. And so it's flexible in the sense that you can stop and think about where you're going to be hiring, but you set these targets and benchmarks. And then, as you're hiring, and then also once the film has gone into production or into distribution, you collect data. And this is why I love that I'm going to be talking to Dave more about data collection here. This is the most important thing, because so many times in Hollywood, people now think they're getting it right. So a lot of times when we took the inclusion writer in for a negotiation, they would say, we're doing that already. And in the beginning, we'd say, great, thank you so much, okay. And then the film would come out, and it would be very clear that there was no commitment to diverse hiring, to inclusive hiring. So now we say, look at the data, actually look at the numbers. And then once you do that, you then compare your data, your targets and your benchmarks, you compare them together, and where you fell short, you make a meaningful contribution into the organizations that serve to uplift and to nurture the people you said you couldn't find. So let's say a cinematographer, there are not very many cinematographers who are qualified to work on a lot of sets, but there are organizations that serve to uplift cinematographers of color, women cinematographers. So then you put money into those organizations so that the next time they exist and the next time you can hire them. We started off with the inclusion writer for individuals with leverage. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, Michael B. Jordan also agreed to do it, and he's been an incredible champion of it, Frances McDormand, and a lot of other individuals with leverage who said, we're going to take this into our negotiations. And we saw some movement, we saw some change. Most importantly, we saw studios starting to get a little scared, because it mattered that they were taking in. But we didn't start to see big change until this happened. And this happened on the heels of the protests against police brutality and racial violence. Suddenly, our phones started to ring again, and everyone wanted to know, how could we use this inclusion writer? And so we got together with Color of Change, and they are an incredible organization that in part shames people publicly and organizations and studios publicly, and sometimes we need that. We also worked with Endeavor Content, which is the studio component of WME, the WME agency, which is kind of the largest agency in Hollywood. AMC Studios, as an entire studio, have agreed to take on the inclusion writer. IMG, we now have an inclusion writer for fashion, which was announced at Fashion Week a couple weeks ago. And the Grammy Awards will be using, give it up for that, come on y'all, that's been hard work. Okay, the Grammy Awards will be using the inclusion writer this year as they hire their crew and also their onstage performers. So we have individuals that are making change, and we're also looking at systemic change. So now, what can you do with all of this? How can you enter into some new worlds? How can you take truth, justice, and love with you? So you as individuals, consider your story important, because it truly, truly is. And your story allows other people to enter into new worlds, enter into your world. And when you share your story, then they feel comfortable sharing theirs, and you get to enter into their world. And if you're a little bit uncomfortable sharing your story, I always say, start with your name. It's a great place to start. And your name does have meaning. Think about the time period that your parents were born in. I probably will tell you something about the story of your name. Or just ask them. Use that studio that we now all carry in our pockets and record them. Ask them to share their names. And also think about data, this qualitative data that you can have when you're sharing stories. And always when you're sharing a story or hearing a story, think about what story is missing or whose stories are missing. What are the non-dominant narratives? And go ahead and use that leverage. I know a lot of you are you're still in school and then you're getting ready to be out in the world. But as you prepare to be out in the world, know that you have leverage and use it. Use it to make change. Use it to make an impact. And then, of course, for companies, there's lots that you can do as a company. Share the story of your company. Share the story of the building your company is in. Share the story of the land your company sits on. Let your employees know, or have your employees share about why the company is named what it is. Tell the truth about that. Sometimes there are very uncomfortable truths about the names of companies and the lands that the companies are on. Think about having a baseline of data. That's what happened with Endeavor Content, with our studios who came on board with the inclusion writer. They needed a baseline, and that's okay. Everybody needs a place to start when you're collecting data and examining it. So start with a baseline and then look at your year over year, or look at a slate of projects that are coming out, or look at your hiring over a year. Measure it, share the story, share the numbers. And then, really importantly, do celebrate your successes. Sometimes when we're negotiating the inclusion writer with a studio, they say, we promise, no, now we're doing it. We're actually collecting the data, and we know we're actually doing well. And we say, fantastic, congratulations, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how you're doing that. What kind of choices have you made to get there? So I have now taken all of these ways that I've entered into new worlds, and I am thrilled to announce to you, and I haven't talked about this a whole lot, but I've created my own production company. I'll have support from Matt and Ben, but it's called True July. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It is True July Productions, Truth, Justice, Love. Of course, we uplift stories that speak truth in pursuit of justice in service of love. So follow on Instagram and Twitter, or I've got a newsletter where I talk about the projects that I'm developing for both Pearl Street and for True July. And now I am so excited to continue the conversation with Dave Mayer.
Cool. I think, yeah,
Yes.
cool. That clap better have been for her, not for me
No, it's
walking
for
up
you.
here. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing.
Absolutely.
I wanted to jump in and ask a little bit more about maybe the origin story of the inclusion writer.
Yeah.
And your work with Kalpana and Stacy Smith. But yeah, how did that come about?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit about that show, Project Greenlight, and starting to work at Pearl Street. And as soon as I started working there, I reached out to Stacy Smith at USC Annenberg, and they do an incredible job of data collection around representation in the industry. And I called and kind of cold called her and just asked what she thought we could do. She had written an op-ed in the Hollywood Reporter in 2014, and she talked about the power that A-listers could have by adding this clause to their contracts. And at that time, she was doing this for gender parity in the industry, or at least gender equity. But then I had her come into Pearl Street, bless you. I had her come into Pearl Street and introduce her to Matt and Ben, and she shared this idea, and they both said, yes, we'll do it. So we got Kalpana on board and really started kind of more internally in Hollywood, telling people about it. We had no idea that Frances McDormand would say that at the Oscars, but that did make a difference. So having them on board was really important.
Yeah, she provides some pretty amazing statistics, in her, and also talks about intersectionality, right,
Absolutely.
A little bit too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's wonderful. And she was kind of known as the person also similar to Color of Change who kind of shamed Hollywood annually. So they'd come out with a grade book where they kind of graded the studios, and no one ever got above, I think, a B- or something. The B- was considered good. But they do really, really rigorous research. And it's important for us to have. Hollywood is finally starting to realize, you know what, if we do our own data, she can't shame us, because then we've done it ourselves. So.
Yeah, I think you're being playful with the shaming, but also saying that actually is having some type of an impact.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you saw this with everything that's going on in Ukraine, for example, but that there was a business school professor who was keeping a list of every company and their interactions.
Yeah.
And that ended up having a pretty big impact on what
Absolutely.
people ultimately did.
It matters. I mean, you have different ways of kind of pushing for change. You've got the call out, which we think about April Rain, who created the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, and we've seen a lot of change since then. You have the call in, where, especially for your friends or family, you can kind of sit down and have conversations. So there are different ways of going about it, but the call out works. It does.
Yeah, maybe we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about tactics or how you use both of those.
Well, so on an ethics level, is that something that is part of what is acceptable to kind of do? And do you see change from making call-outs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of them can be effective. I think the more the idea actually gets internalized as being something that is of real value and importance, then it's going to be longer lasting than sort of initial reaction. But I also think social norms take a second to change, and once they start to move, then I think that there's less of the need for the call out. I think sometimes, I thought it was interesting how you talked about Matt Damon's sort of misstep here or there.
And continues.
Yes.
Still has some missteps, yes. But don't we all? I mean, the other thing to constantly remember is that none of us is perfect, right? And so what I don't believe in is cancel culture. I think, I think we kind of can't get very far if we're just canceling folks. That actually, giving people an opportunity to learn and grow is important. I mean, then some folks go too far, and you told them many times, and then, but Matt is a perfect example of somebody, he genuinely means well, but he says and does some things still that are harmful. And once he gets that, he can kind of pivot and change, but he's got to hear it.
Yeah, so some of the research I've done shows that white men tend to be have the least favorable perceptions when it comes to various types of diversity initiatives. And so you've clearly had, experience working with him and other white men, but on the sort of call out versus let me
Call
bring
in.
it, call in. You know, how do you think about that?
I think, I think it's kind of precisely this example of there's the systemic change that we want, and I think call out is a really important piece of that. April Rain had no relationship with the Oscars or with the Academy, but what she had was a huge following on social media, and so she was able to call out something that large, a structure that large, using social media, and I think that was the only way it could happen, because lots of us are trying to have these kind of individual, personal conversations in Hollywood, and we don't see things change much. But if you've got friends of 40 years, then in that case, you might want to just call them over quietly, because the whole world is dumping on them anyway on Twitter, you know. But so in that case, they're friends, and you know they mean well, and so you can take an opportunity to kind of call in. So I do think systemically, I think call out works really well, but individually, it doesn't always work. People get hurt. White men have feelings. Did y'all know that? They do. It's often fragility, and then it shuts everything down, and then you gotta kind of coddle a little bit. But if you've got a friendship with white men, or if you are a white man, and there are some here, y'all are good. Y'all are good. We need you, which is really the most important piece. Is we have to do all of this together. There is not going to be a time where any of us, our whole point is that Hollywood becomes more inclusive, not excluding anybody, really. So we need you. We need you.
Well, I'm curious, as you mentioned Fashion Week, and like the fashion industry is now adopting. I saw that in the Times just the other day.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what barriers you face when you're trying to get either an industry or a well-known actor or entertainer to get on board. Does it seem like there are certain things that halt them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first big hurdle was early on. I mentioned it, just places saying we're already doing it. And they genuinely mean, they really thought they were doing it. So studios would say, no, they'd even say, we're way ahead of you. We've already got this. And then inevitably, the film would come out, or the production would come out. It was very clear they weren't. But initially, what do you say? If someone says they're doing it, we wanted to trust that, and we didn't want to push against that, and so we did. I think another one is time, and it's true. If anybody here works in production, once the money's there, you have zero time. The next thing you know, you've got to be on set. So the hiring happens really, really quickly. And so in a lot of cases, even in some things that we're negotiating the writer on right now that Matt and Ben are in, we get into the negotiation when they're about to go shoot the next week. And so it's already kind of too late. As I said, there are these 4 steps to it. You have to be really intentional. You have to stop and take some time. So the way we're addressing that at Pearl Street is that we're using the inclusion writer as soon as we start to develop a project. So as soon as I find filmmakers or a story that we want to make, we're immediately having these exact conversations from the beginning. So that by the time we even go to hire a writer or we go to hire a director, we're then taking the conversation in with them and letting them know we're going to use it. So it's a big difference when you have the time, but time is definitely a reason that we hear a lot. Another is it's reverse discrimination, it's quotas, and Kalpana is so wonderful about responding to that as a civil rights attorney, but this is not quotas, it is not illegal.
I think Stacey Smith had a great response to that, saying, well, we didn't call it quotas when there was just sort of a more dominant practice that we just never thought of before.
Exactly.
But it can have that type of an effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this something where you see that this could move into other industries as well?
Yeah.
One thing that we talk about in the business school a lot is that issues that business leaders used to not get into, they are getting into a lot more. And again, we're seeing this with the what's going on in Ukraine and the tragedy there. And every leader has to make a statement. Do you foresee a time? Are you optimistic that, I don't know, before a CEO takes on a role, they say, I'll come here, but, and then, do you see that happening?
Absolutely. I have to say that the reason that it, initially got called the Hollywood Inclusion Rider is that we just happened to have a relationship with two A-listers that we could ask to use it. But the Inclusion Rider is about hiring. So in any situation, in any industry, you can take the Inclusion Rider into your hiring practices. It is absolutely for any industry. I want to mention really quickly, because we talked about Ukraine, a non-dominant narrative. Part of the narrative that the press has not addressed at all is the rejection of African immigrants in Ukraine who have been turned away by Ukrainians. And that's that's just a truth that we have got to say and accept and to deal with, that the very folks who are being oppressed right now are also turning and oppressing Africans at the same time. It's a non-dominant narrative that needs to be part of everything we talk about when we talk about this war.
Yeah.
Y'all can't,
I heard some snaps.
I hear those
Do you
snaps
hear these
in the
out
back.
there? Yeah.
It's the truth. It's uncomfortable, but it's the truth.
Well, we've got a few more minutes here.
Yeah.
So you have probably partly you and partly a skill you've built over time, where you talk about something that's the truth that's very difficult. It's true.
Yeah.
It's hard to disagree. And so I wonder how, for folks here, if you're thinking about building that sort of moral courage muscle, like what has that been like for you? And then what advice would you give, our students here?
Absolutely. This is exactly why I start with the personal story, because everybody's story matters, and everybody's story is an ability to enter into a new world, because we're all so individually unique. And so when I encourage people to ask their parents or their guardians or whoever raised them about their own stories, I encourage you to ask them, for example, who was your first love? What was that experience like? How did you learn to tie your shoe? Start with those light stories. Don't dive into what does it mean that you're white, right? Or don't dive into the hard things. Start with love. Start with funny stories, humorous stories, and allow for the fact that some of this is humorous. Those Supreme Court cases, when we look at them now, it's ridiculous. And it's just kind of funny. I mean, the funny that unfortunately harmed lots of people and determined who got resources in this country and who didn't. But also when you look at the ridiculous nature of it, you can laugh if you know that we're making changes, if we're still making an impact around it. So I think it's really important to be brave. It's really important to know that it does matter when you speak truth, and that you can do so in a way that still maintains love, because speaking truth is love. It's a form of love. So as long as you remember that in that truth-telling, you are loving someone by speaking that truth. We are loving the Africans who are being rejected in Ukraine. We are loving the Ukrainians. We are showing them love by speaking those truths about what's happening. It's all just love. Yeah, I'm such a hippie. I blame everything on Mama Trudy, though. Truly, it is all her fault.
Did you grow up in a college town or something?
I did. Yeah. I did. I didn't even talk about my hippie commune days in D.C. So.
Let me ask one more question here.
Dave, wait a minute.
Oh.
Let me ask you a question. How did you get your name?
Oh. Let's see. So my name's David Mayer. I did 23andMe and found out I'm 98.5% Ashkenazi Jew.
No, you're not.
No shock there.
Okay.
And so my family's from Eastern Europe. In Judaism, you often name someone after the first letter of that person's name, someone who's passed away. So evidently, I was named after my Aunt Dorothy. I don't think I had an Aunt Dorothy. I think my parents just liked the name David and used that.
Then they just said that's why.
I looked up, I was born in 1977, so
Okay.
David was the fourth most popular name at that time.
Okay.
And it means beloved. So
Look at
I
that.
didn't have like the truth, justice, love. I had like love and risk aversion. I would say like
That's,
those were,
hey, risk
yeah.
aversion is a form of love. Absolutely. I love it.
Yeah, but thank you for letting me, encouraging us to all tell our stories about that.
Yes, and that, see, there's some humor there, right? And that's important. You can start with that humor. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're at, Michigan Ross here. I asked what you think about some on the individual level, what things you can do to kind of build that type of moral courage. What about for us even more specifically? I know Carolyn works on this, thinks about it all the time. Francine, a lot of people here, a lot of faculty members and students. What types of things would you think we should have in mind?
Thank you for asking, and I forgot to say thank you so much to the DEI committee for bringing me also, and for all of your hard work. I think this is where you get to lean on data, right? Because now you're going to have large numbers that are going to help you look at how you're doing. And so what you can do is think of that data as your opportunity for truth telling. When there's a new position for hiring, stop, look at your data, think about what your targets are. What do you want the school to represent? What kinds of voices? What kinds of worlds? How do you want the school to enter into new worlds? And lean on data. That is truly the most important thing. And there's so many resources. Also, I should mention you can go to inclusionwriter.org where you can get it's free and open to the public. It's really open source for everybody. There's the individual version of the Inclusion Writer there, the company version of the Inclusion Writer, and lots of resources for data collection, for hiring in the entertainment industry, and fashion and music. There are resources there. But yeah, the data collection is absolutely key if you want systemic change. So let's do that, Ross. Can I check back in with you all and see how you're doing on that data collection and reporting?
Yes, no public shaming.
No, I promise. I promise. No canceling, I promise.
But I'm sure that these types of numbers are things that we're heading towards.
Yes, yes.
So I am going to have to wrap us up here. I just encourage everyone, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And just encourage you to think about taking some of these ideas and how you'd actually apply them individually in your own lives. And we're also thinking systemically what that looks like here, and in any organization that you're a part of. Can we give Fanshen a round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to stick around. We should mention I'm doing a couple workshops. I don't know if they're closed, but doing some workshops tomorrow, but also I'll be here, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have and help to inspire you to go and enter into some new worlds. Thank you
Wonderful.
all so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Thanks.